What you doing?
I'm working.
What you working on?
I'm writing an article for the website.
Is there any point? Does anyone read your website?
I'm an author. Most of what I do doesn't have a point.
You want to watch a movie or something?
No,
Why not?
because I'm working.
What you working on?
You're bored, aren't you?
Yes. No. I am not doing your work for you. I'm not that bored.
Okay, watch the new Marvels movie and do an analysis of it for me.
No. I don't wanna. Disney films are terrible, made by terrible people for terrible, disgusting, intellectually stunted, sociopathic, immature assholes. You should watch it.
Well, someone's got to watch it.
I don't know how to do an analysis.
It's easy. You just tear it apart to find the hidden meanings, the subtle interplay of narrative dynamics, concealed thematic symbology, and refracted metaphors.
In a Disney movie, aren't they all just propaganda aimed at implanting deviant ideas in the minds of children?
I mean, yeah, that's a good point. Just get Aisha to do it then. She can take a break from holding the door open. There's an enduring cliche, a meme going around that sometimes a door is just a door, where teachers have tried to explain to students that the colour of the door actually represents something. And the idea is that it actually doesn't, and the author wouldn't dream of actually putting in any kind of symbols. But of course, everything has symbols. Everything that a writer does means something, whether it means it unconsciously or consciously. But authors, writers, movie makers, we put in symbols to represent the ideas that we're trying to put across. And any story worth making will have these kind of symbols in it.
Are you saying that the old cliché of English teachers explaining to bored students that the color of a door representing something is actually true?
Of course it's true. Directors, movie makers, writers, we all put symbols in so that we can guide the audience in discovering the same things that we've discovered, which inspired us to write this story in the first place. Everything means something.
In contemporary literary studies, a theme is a central topic, subject, or message within a narrative. Themes can be divided into two categories. A work's thematic concept is what readers think the work is about, and its thematic statement being what the work says about the subject. Just so we're clear, horrible writing is not a theme. It would be nice if Marvel, Star Wars, Disney, Warner Brothers, and every company owned by BlackRock and Vanguard could finally learn to accept that.
Writing a story is hard, very, very difficult. Keeping motivated while you write down thousands and thousands of words, most of which you know you're going to prune away, is incredibly difficult. It's soul destroying. And the theme is the thing that keeps us going. Where the plot of a story is the mind, the theme is the heart. It's what inspired us in the first place to want to write this story. So the theme exists as an undercurrent through all stories worth telling. And it's interesting that as Hollywood is degrading into making the worst movies in recorded history, what's dying off is the soul of the industry, the soul of the entire Western world, in fact. While that's under assault, our movies are showing that dynamic in becoming empty, hollow vessels. But the theme is the soul of the story, and any good movie, any good story is going to have very obvious themes and more subtle themes buried below those. On the surface, a film like Iron Man, the original Iron Man movie, looks like it's just a very basic film about a man who puts on a metal suit and goes out and has some action scenes, but there is more to it than that. At the beginning of the film, we see Iron Man, Tony Stark, as a lazy, arrogant son of his father who doesn't really have an identity of his own. Then we strip away all the things that he has, all the privilege that he's been given, and we dump him in a cave with his money and his resources gone. He has to rely on his intelligence and his identity if he's going to escape the cave. The cave itself is actually a metaphorical representation of his entire life. He's been fitted inside somebody else's existence. He's got to get away from the cave, and he's got to break out of the Stark identity and find out who he really is. That's what the film's all about. It's about finding out who you really are and being a person worth being, and not just living in somebody else's shadow.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
That's why at the end of the movie, where he stands up in front of the audience and says, I am Iron Man, it's a very, very important scene. It's not just him doing something stupid or arrogant. It's literally looking at the camera, looking at the audience and saying to them, I now have my own identity. I'm no longer just my father's son. I'm no longer just a Stark. Now I'm my own person and I'm taking responsibility for who I am.
The Wikipedia says this about metaphors. A metaphor is a figure of speech that, for rhetorical effect, directly refers to one thing by mentioning another. It may provide, or obscure, clarity or identify hidden similarities between two different ideas. Mind you, you can't trust the Wikipedia these days since it's just edited by ordinary, everyday, normal people, and sometimes the CIA. A metaphor is when you use the idea of something to stand in for the idea of something else. It's like if I was to say that I am a metaphor for the dangers of artificial intelligence or that Jack is a metaphor for the general concept of failure.
Stories are full of metaphors, whether they're movies or books, short stories or TV shows. They are full of metaphors. So a metaphor is when we take something unrelated and we compare something that we want to be related to it so that we can show you how these ideas have other forms. Usually so the audience can understand them more clearly. Now, a great example of this is the everyday story Three Little Pigs. We're all aware of this story where the first pig builds its house out of straw, the second out of sticks, and the last out of bricks. When finally the wolf comes along, it destroys all of the houses except for the brick house. Now, in most of the original stories, the pigs are eaten except for the one who built the house out of bricks. Now, this is a children's story, and children unconsciously get the message. We understand what this story is really all about. And what it is it's not about three pigs at all. They're metaphors. They represent the three stages of our emotional development. As a child, we build our house out of straw. We do whatever it takes to do it quickly so we can move on to something more interesting. Later on, as we're teenagers, we learn to build things out of sticks. We do a better job, but we're still not going all the way. And then finally, when we actually achieve adulthood, we do things properly and we build our house out of bricks. A child understands that the pig that survived, the one that makes it, is the one that did the job right. He's the one that wasn't lazy, didn't cut corners, did things correctly. The wolf in this story is also a metaphor representing the world in itself. We see the same thing with Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf is often used to represent the dangers of society as they come towards you. In the original story, all of these wolves overcome the heroine or the heroes to help teach children understand that the dangers are serious and the only way to overcome them is to do things properly.
As a literary device or artistic form, an allegory is a narrative or visual representation in which a character, place, or event can be interpreted to represent a meaning with moral or political significance. Authors have used allegory throughout history in all forms of art to illustrate or convey complex ideas and concepts in ways that are comprehensible or striking to its viewers, readers, or listeners. Writers and speakers typically use allegories to convey buried meanings through symbolic figures, actions, imagery, or events, which together create the moral, spiritual, or political meaning the author wishes to convey.
An allegory is when the entire story really represents something else. Usually in movies we see a lot of religious allegories, especially today, often related to the story of Christ and his resurrection. An example of this would be something like RoboCop. Now on the surface, again, this is an action movie, a violent piece of nonsense. But if we take it apart and we're looking more closely, we see that originally he is resurrected after being crucified. He's shot to pieces by a gang of evil people who represent the society he lives in. He's then taken apart and he's resurrected in his metal suit as the savior of the city. He later walks on water, performs other miracles. It's a clear religious allegory for the resurrection of Christ. And we see this in other stories such as Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where Aslan represents Jesus who's put to death and then resurrects himself. These stories are fairly common, but there are other kinds of allegory as well. A story, Animal Farm, is an allegory for communism. In that story, the pigs take over after the humans are pushed out of a farm, and they take over and work the farm so that it's for and by the animals for mutual success. Eventually the pigs take over and there's no difference between them and the original farmers. Everybody is sacrificed, which is a way that the writer saw communism. These kind of allegories exist where the entire story represents another story and tries to make you see the story in a different way, or in a way that's more appropriate to a modern audience.
Symbolism is very much like metaphors, except that they tend to be more well established. We recognize specific symbols and they resonate unconsciously with the ideas that the filmmaker is trying to encourage. Maybe this has something to do with why Jack sits around talking to a pile of broken laptops wrapped in Christmas lights.
I'm sorry, he's an idiot.
Symbols, such as the colour of a door, are hidden everywhere in movies. Superman, the choice of colours in his costume isn't an accident. As we see in the most recent versions of the movie, his costumes have got darker and darker. Batman too, who used to be blue and grey, is now wearing entirely black. Superman's colours are now washed out, much darker, much more sombre. And this symbolism tells us that the stories are darker, the morality is less strong, and we see society falling apart and becoming degenerated, just as our movies also represent these heroic characters in a much less sympathetic light. By the end of the Superman movie, Superman kills somebody, and this is his cardinal rule. He would never murder. He takes his adversary and breaks his neck. Now, this is nothing that we would have seen in any other Superman media. Only one where the costume is getting darker, the tone is getting darker. There's no optimism in it, and we see this symbolically in the colours of the costume that he's chosen. Batman also would never kill. However, in most of the movies now, he quite happily murders people. But again, we don't see that in any of the media where he's wearing a blue and grey costume. It's not an accident. It's not that they've made the costume darker so they can justify the killing. It's just that the tone has darkened, so it makes sense to these people to have darkened the costume. But there are lots of other symbols hidden in stories, and most of them are off-the-shelf symbols, such as a mirror. A mirror represents an alternative reality. It represents a reflection of what we really see.
I don't understand.
We see things like butterflies, wolves, dogs. All of these represent something, and if you know what the language of the symbols are, it's very clear what the stories are trying to say. Now, for the most part, we pick these up unconsciously. We all know that a mirror is reflecting a normal reality and showing it in a different way. And unconsciously, this makes a connection with us. So these symbols are like a dictionary of unconscious programming.
Sometimes a story functionally follows the plot of a different story, often expanding on the story beats and retelling it in a different way. This method of storytelling is designed to have parallels that are easy to spot and is used to take a story that has value and present it in a way that a modern audience can see the point that the original is trying to make.
Now, a secret story is when a movie or a book completely follows an existing story to tell it in a different way. There's an original story called The Cave by Plato. This is an allegory about people moving towards freedom. People are tied up in a cave and they only see the reflection in the wall of the fires behind them. So the shadows they see on the wall is their entire understanding of reality. A man eventually breaks free, walks out of the cave and sees for the first time the sunlight, and it's painful. His eyes can't deal with it because they've never seen light before. Eventually he learns to survive and realizes that outside in the real world he's much better off. He adapts, he becomes stronger. He goes back inside and tries to free the people from the cave, but they don't want to be free. He tells them the story, they don't believe him at first, and then when they do, they're afraid of the pain that he'll have to take them through. So this allegory is all about freedom and how once you've attained it, other people don't want your help. Now, this is exactly what The Matrix is about. It's a beat-for-beat remake of an ancient allegory by Plato of the cave. It tells of a man who's freed from captivity that he didn't understand, didn't even see was happening. He sees the world as it really is. It throws him in pain. As he goes back in to release the others, he has to fight against resistance. And when we take it apart, that's really all there is to the Matrix.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
After that, it's just action scenes bolted over the top and some other odd little allegories. But a secret story is when we take an existing story and we expand upon it to make it more accessible to a different audience, where we're taking the value of the original message and we're turning it into something that people can understand. We see this a lot in films, we see this a lot in everything. The Bible has been taken apart and remade into various different stories, as we've touched on before, but lots of other stories are broken down and remade this way. So movies have hidden messages. They have a lot of secret things to tell us, whether it will be a picture on the wall that represents the narrative, or whether it's things hidden that the characters say, or other symbols that are hidden within the movie somewhere. The things to look for is repeating symbols. We'll see the same thing over and over. Like in The Truman Show, you see constant X's all over the place. You see them everywhere and you wonder what they mean, until you eventually see a cardboard box with Xmas. Now the X replaces the word Christ, and when you analyze the film, it's an allegory for Christ. It's an allegory for Christ's ascension to heaven, escaping from the base reality. And that's why they're warning you all the way through with the X symbol that Truman is Christ and his father is a different character. We see these kind of symbols all over the place. The first thing to look for is repetition. They will remind you constantly that these things are here. What it's like is a string of words. We can pick up the words, there's lots of symbols. We'll see mirrors everywhere, we'll see other things everywhere. And each of these is a word. And the trick is to put these words into a sentence so that we can understand it. Now there's going to be mirrors where they don't mean anything. So once we put all of these different things together and then compile them, we'll start to see an image emerging. And that's what you've got to do if you want to understand what's really behind a movie. You've got to look at all the symbols, weigh them up and understand what they really mean. Now, part of doing a movie analysis is also looking into the history of it. Who wrote it? Who directed it? What do these people believe in? What are they trying to say? You can often get a lot more depth into what a story is all about by looking at the people who created it. They will want to put their politics, their beliefs, their religion into their stories, and they'll want to tell you about the things they're passionate about. That's just human nature. So look into what the story means. What is it all about? Who made it? What kind of messages are they likely to signal? We see a lot of things from Disney where it's just politics. They're trying to drive and normalize certain sexualities or gender preferences. That's not the kind of symbol that we are looking for. They're too obvious, they're too overt. They don't require any intelligence. A good artist will embed them in so that once you've watched the film, you really have no idea that they were there, except you've been unconsciously conditioned towards accepting their ideas. And that's unfortunately how stories have always worked and always will work. Go back in time to see the original Greek myths. They were often, as a hero, had a demigod, a person who was the son of a god and a mortal human. These people were the heroes of the stories. And the unconscious messaging is very common today with superhero stories, where the message is that you're not one of them, that you are not somebody that will ever make a real impact. You're somebody that's just along for the ride. You're basically no more than the audience. It's stripping away your power. It's telling you that you are not someone that can ever make a change. Go back to movies of the 80s and they were about everyday people who had become vigilantes or cops or something that was making a difference. It was about normal people put into unusual situations. These days it's people who have special powers or abilities, and it's trying to show you that you don't really have the power to make a change, so trust the people that do. In other words, the people that funded and produced the movies. This is a dangerous precedent, but as I say, it's been around for thousands of years. Once you know how these tricks work, they don't work. And that's why it's so important to understand that movies and stories have these symbols and understand how to decipher them so that you're not a victim of being unconsciously processed.